And I want to throw out a question to the three of you, right? Most of these people are here, they come to present their inventions, what things they have, and to me, it seems like it's the best time to start up, right? You can, you don't need infrastructure anymore. You can go to the cloud and get some servers, so you don't need to worry about this IP and all these things that you need to worry before. And software is all open source, right? So it's all there. So somehow there is this thing around that it's never been a better time and easier time to start up. And I like to throw the question to the panel. What is your opinion about that? What would you say about it? If I'm going to start with, we'll go one by one, Andrea, Ryan, and then Brian.
Okay. So I've started two companies, one in 2006, which was right before a downturn, and another in 2011, which was a very hype time, but not for what we were doing. It was a hype time for mobile and software. I think, first of all, I think it's always a hard time to start a company. There is no good time. Even in the bubble days, there was a lot of money and you didn't need to have a business plan, but making that company successful was not easy. So what I see, and my view is unique to Silicon Valley, I'm curious what others have to say, there's a lot of condensing of the VC funds in Silicon Valley. There have not been a lot of great exits. You hear about the billion-dollar sales, but there have not been a lot of IPOs or big sales of startups, especially startups outside the internet and the social media domains. So if you're starting companies in those areas, which are not my expertise, you have a lot of competition, huge amount of competition, and somewhat the bloom is off the rose there because there was a lot of money, and again, not some successes, but not a lot. If you're starting technology in what we do, which is wireless and communications and infrastructure, it's very hard to start a company because you need investors that are going to go the long haul. It's very expensive. Selling into carriers, actually the VCs in Silicon Valley run like the wind from any investment in a carrier infrastructure type of startup. So, there's not as much money as there used to be. There's not as much enthusiasm about technology, deep technology companies that are outside of social media and internet. And I think that makes it very hard to start a company. And then the other thing that I see in Silicon Valley is I see a lot of people that have started one or two or three companies, great technologists. Those companies weren't successful for whatever reason. So it's harder to get the right pool of talent to either be your founders or your early employees because people are burnt out. It's hard to do a startup. It's hard to put your heart and soul into something and see it fail. And so I actually think it's a very hard time to do this.
Okay. So
I would absolutely agree with that, and I think the word startup is really fashionable right now, and everybody's just doing a startup, and you hear in the news about this startup, this investment, and this startup did their IPO. But I think it is really having competition, and you mentioned open source. Just because you're using open source doesn't mean you have IP issues. There's issues there on whether you're complying with that open source license or the way you are using that open source. Is it infringing somebody else's IP that you're going to have to deal with the lawsuit down the road? So there still are, I think, the same issues that have been around, since before startups were fashionable in the last 5 years, are there today, and maybe even more amplified, as Andrea mentioned, because of the competition. You're competing for money, you're competing for attention, and so it's a pretty crowded space depending on what your market is.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not going to add a lot to this. It's an easy time to start a company, or an easier time to start a company because of the capital. And I agree, it depends on which sector you're in. I'm mostly software, internet, mobile, healthcare technologies. So these are all very hot markets right now. And there is a lot of money. It's an easy time to get started. It's a hard time to build a company, though. In any market, it's always a hard time to build a company in any market. So you got to know that going in. Even in the ones flush with capital, because then you're flush with competition, and that becomes very difficult to differentiate yourself and break through. Or it's challenging, and you got to raise a lot of capital. And the competition between sectors is important too, because if you've got a boom in one market like internet and mobile, and you can invest small amounts and fail fast, it sucks a lot of capital away from other sectors. and makes it difficult for something in another sector like wireless and infrastructure to attract capital because everybody's going to where the shiny star is. And that's a little bit of what's going on right now too. So always a hard time to build a company. It's easier in some places to start it. Doesn't mean that you should, just because there's a little bit of money to get going.
Well, we hope that doesn't discourage our audience. We're going to let Ryan go. He needs to catch a plane. Thank you for coming. So not as easy as it looks, and maybe in our industry, in the wireless communication industry, maybe even harder. So I hope the audience doesn't get discouraged for that. Moving on, we have another question for the panel.
We do. And one other question, which I can't remember, but I do have a good question, which is if somebody is looking for they want to do a startup, and after everything that you've talked about, they still want to do this, how do they find the funding, and how do they go about finding these contacts if they need to make it work?
Okay, so finding the funding, you can probably speak to that more, but I think everything comes together in the sense that you don't go out looking for funding until you found what you're doing, to some extent who your co-funders are. It's especially hard to find funding when this is your first startup. So one of the things that I benefited from in my first startup was that I was co-founding it with someone who had done a company before. Mm-hmm. And our lead investor, in fact, our seed investor, Sequoia Capital, which is one of the most well-known VC funds in Silicon Valley, had invested in his first company and it went IPO. So it's much easier to find funding when you're a successful entrepreneur because people know you have a success story. When you're starting out and you don't have that track record, it's harder. It helps to team up with people that have good track records. Even if you have a great idea, I think in my experience, investors are wary of investing in first-time entrepreneurs. Again, that wasn't true in the bubble days. In the bubble days, you would have, two kids out of Stanford with a business plan on a napkin get, billions of dollars. That's not true anymore. And investors are looking for people with experience. And I think wisely so, because experience helps. So I think that how do you get started? It's kind of, it's a process and one that you should not rush. Because the investors that you pick at the beginning and the founders that you pick at the beginning, those two things are going to have the biggest impact on your company. And so even if somebody's throwing money at you, that's not necessarily the investor that you should take.
I absolutely agree with that. The first investors are very, very important for you to choose. And the track record is important. If you've got the track record, it is a lot easier to get access. It's a lot easier to invest money or get money invested in you, and it's a lot easier to know which partners you want to have as investors. If this is your first time through, I think the advisor route is a great route. Go build your business plan, find your founding team, look at your network, go network out there, get introductions into people in the industry that have been successful entrepreneurs, successful domain experts that have access. The investors tap all sorts of resources to decide where they're going to make their investment. They look to academia, they look to domain experts, they look to industry, they look to prior entrepreneurs, they look to angel investors. All of these people are constantly being reached out to by investors to say, where are the good opportunities? What's going on in the market? What are the important trends I should be aware of? And if you can team up with some people that get your market opportunity, that get you, and are willing to use their credibility to refer you into other investors or into investors, then that gives you a lot of credibility walking in. That was the case with my first startup. My co-founder and I, neither one of us had a track record. But I found a great set of angel investors and advisors, and they all referred us into places, into some of the best VCs in the country. Benchmark Capital, Foundation Capital, Sequoia, others like that. And then I found some of my own as well. But that was through good networking. And I think you want to surround yourself with people that can provide that trust if you don't have the experience or track record today.
And I have actually a question following up a little bit to the topic you were touching on now of finding capital and where to find it. And I'm not picking on you, Andrea, because you are from Silicon Valley, but there is a thought also that really venture capital, and if you want access to it or financing, you have to be first of all, here in the US, and then you have to be in the East Coast, Boston and New York and that area, or you have to be in California. Is that a fair statement? What about if you, and I want to ask you, because I know from the work that you do in PowerShift that you have done tremendous work with the Far East, China, and I'll be very happy if you can share the insights with the group here today.
Yeah, I think things are changing. I mean, Silicon Valley is the epicenter of venture capital and tech entrepreneurship, and that's not going to change. If it changes, it's going to be very, very far into the future. So it's a relevant thing to consider. Should you go there? Should you base out of there? But what I'm seeing globally, we're Austin based. The last company we started is a company called Appconomy, and it's started out of China, and it's based in Shanghai, and we got investment from Qiming Ventures out in Shanghai. So there's globally in markets, especially if you look in mobile. And social internet in particular, you're seeing hotbeds of investment activity and successful entrepreneurial stories coming out of places, in Europe. Berlin's a hotbed for startups and venture capital. In Europe, seeing it in Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen in China. So it's becoming a more global phenomenon now, especially with mobile. And you think about, it's really the first time that we've had technology in a computing sense be adopted in mass and on a global scale ahead of the U.S. And what I mean by that is there are billions of smartphone users globally, and China is the largest market for smartphones with about 700 million a year out there. So the global market's becoming much more relevant. There are many places globally in different markets that you can successfully start up and successfully find capital. And I think even you look around the globe, the most successful venture capitalists have set up satellites in a lot of different places. And I know in China, in particular, GGV's out there, Sequoia's out there, Oak is out there, and they have local teams investing capital. They've got funds dedicated to China in particular. I know that's the case in other markets as well. And there are also local VCs that have been successful there too. So I think it's less and less so that you have to be in Silicon Valley, but it's still an important question to ask yourself because it still is the epicenter of tech entrepreneurship. So
I agree with all that, and I just add a few things. So I am in Silicon Valley, so it makes sense to go to Silicon Valley for my investors. And I think it is helpful to have your investors nearby. They have to travel to board meetings if you have questions for them. Having a good relationship with your investors is very important because remember, they can often typically kick out the CEO or close down the company once they get control. So having a close relationship with them is important, and having them locally is important too. So if your company is not based in Silicon Valley, it's not clear it makes sense to have a Silicon Valley investor, even if you have an offer for that. Entrepreneurship and investment is becoming more global and has been so since the bubble days. I mean, Israel is also a hotbed of investment. The fact that these firms are opening up local offices in other places, I think, speaks to the fact that it's important also for them to be local, not just to know what's going on in the company, but if you're local, you know talent pools, you know potential customers. You can really help your entrepreneurs a lot more if you're based where they are. So again, I wouldn't say, and Silicon Valley is contracting big time. So yeah, Sequoias and Benchmarks and those guys are great investors, but you go with a third tier Silicon Valley firm, they may not be around by your second or third round, and that's actually what happened with one of my startups, that the firm shrunk and the investor who was our lead investor was no longer part of the firm by the second round of investment. So there's no one answer as to where to get your investment from. Again, I think just being very systematic about looking at your options.
yeah, can I echo one thought on that? The local part is absolutely relevant. When I say about considering Silicon Valley, I've had experience with this. Trying to get Silicon Valley to invest outside of Silicon Valley, they do look occasionally and they'll take an interest, but very rarely do they do the investment. Now in Austin, there are examples where that's happened, but it's rare. So you're going to be wasting a lot of time. When I say Silicon Valley, you think about the consideration is, do you think about if it's your first round of capital, are you moving there and basing out of there and locating there, and does that make sense? that's the consideration. I've gone through that a couple times, thinking about should we locate this company in Silicon Valley for that reason. But otherwise, I strongly endorse looking local and thinking about that.
Okay.
I think I have a question from the audience.
While they get that, I will have a quick question for Andrea, and this is the prototyping versus PowerPoint.
Okay.
So if I remember correctly, during your presentation, you were saying, well, you know, it takes in a chipset in our field, it might take 200 million, and you know, not everyone has 200 million or can get there. So do you go for the PowerPoint then, or?
Yeah. It's a good question,
Is it a good solution?
and it also touches on the where to get your funding from as well. So the 200 million was the total that Quantenna has raised. Obviously, the first round was not 200 million; it was 10 million, and it took about 20 million to get a working chip. But so with the chip company, you have to do PowerPoint to start. And I still remember our PowerPoint slides, and we had no idea what we were doing. And the benefit of PowerPoint is that you don't need to know what you're doing because you can still make pretty slides. But again, especially as an early or first-time entrepreneur, you're not going to have a lot of credibility with PowerPoint. And if you're struggling to raise money, it often makes sense to raise a little bit from friends, family, angels, to build something, to build a proof of concept, which is a pre-prototype, to demonstrate your ideas or build a prototype so you can show something real, that, this is not just slideware, it's something real. And I think that can help you raise more money later on. So it really depends on your credibility. If you're super credible, you can raise millions of dollars with PowerPoint. But if you're not, you probably need to do something more than that.
Brian is laughing a little bit.
Yeah,
Do you have anything to add?
There's a simple model on investment decisions around management risk, market risk, and technology risk. So if you think about it, you're a first-time entrepreneur. Let's say you got a great market. Management risk is massively high, right? Market risk is low. Management risk is super high. If you got PowerPoint, technology risk is off the charts. Guess what? You're not getting money. So you got to lower that. And maybe that's with a little bit of capital, build a prototype, build something. But you want to take some of this down. Find some good partners or advisors, take that management risk down. So it's a simple model, and it's not that simple to make a decision, but it'll help give you some guidance.